Welcome to Cameron's Conversations podcast. So today I thought I'd talk a little bit about aggressive weight loss. So a little bit of context around what aggressive weight loss is. So I would typically think of aggressive weight loss being where we're looking to lose more than 1% of body weight per week. Anything really above that is typically going to be fairly aggressive weight loss. Now, I'm going to give a quick bit of context to that. This doesn't necessarily apply to those first couple of weeks. Even where you're kind of taking quite a moderate approach to weight loss, you often drop quite a lot in the first couple of weeks. And I'm sure you'll have seen that before. Almost everyone's tried a diet before. Almost everyone has done it, the first couple of weeks and seen a bigger loss. Then it tends to settle down, right? You maybe drop a couple of kilos in week 1 and 2, or even in week 1, and then it kind of goes to a more steady pace. That's pretty typical, right? That's quite normal. But we're going to ignore those first 2 weeks. If, let's say, we're weeks 3, 4, 5 onwards, right, and we are still dropping more than 1% of body weight, that's where I would say that's, it's fairly aggressive, right? Like we're looking to kind of drop weight pretty quickly. And when we talk about being aggressive, it's just about the rate of weight loss. That's really what we're kind of counting here. Now, aggressive weight loss diets are useful in the same way that being more moderate is also very useful. And unfortunately, as much as it's nice to kind of pigeonhole people into preferences and approach, I have done both myself very successfully, and I've used both with clients very successfully. One is not better than the other. It's a bit like tools in a toolbox. You use the wrong one at the wrong time and you're not going to get the result you want. And if you use the right one at the right time, you're going to get a great result. I think that's really, really important. Now, they're also not inherently bad. And I think this is really important. When I'm talking about more aggressive weight loss, this is why I wanted to do this podcast, is to give more context to what does that actually look like? What are the pros? What are the cons? That side of things, rather than us kind of say, oh, well, losing weight really quickly is bad. Well, actually, that's not what the research says. This whole thing, if you lose it really, really quickly, you'll pile it all back on. It's actually nonsense. When that occurs is simply because people have not changed any of their habits or behaviors that they pile it back on. But you could do a moderate weight loss approach and you could still, in theory, pile it on. The only difference is that for someone doing a moderate approach, they tend to be doing it for a bit longer. So some of the habits are more built in. So for example, if someone's consciously been getting their protein up for the last 5 months, they've probably got a good chance of wanting to carry on with that. Whereas if someone's maybe just dieted quite aggressively for 8 weeks, that habit might not stick quite so much. So those are kind of factors, right? But that is the key thing. It's what you do afterwards that matters. So I absolutely have had some clients where I've been like, right, let's get in, let's smash this first bit of weight loss, and then let's ease up. So I've put people through an aggressive phase into a more moderate phase. I've done kind of aggressive phases into maintenance, aggressive into maintenance. That works really well. So some people work better in short, sharp sprints. Great. That works really, really well too. Everybody's different. The first diet I ever did, I went at kind of moderate pace. I dropped about half a kilo a week. I did that for the better part of 9 months. And I ended up dropping 20 kilos, right? That's what I think I ended up. I think off the top of my head, that works out as 0.6 kilos per week. Someone will probably correct me on that. But anyway, that's what it averages out at, or what I ended up averaging out at was about 0.6 kilos per week. So very, very steady, solid, still a good amount of weight loss by all means. But I did that for a very long time. I've also done much shorter phases of weight loss. So last September, I did a short phase of weight loss over 6 weeks and dropped 5 kilos, right? So that was pretty quick. Now, the first kilo and a half of that is probably going to be a bit of water weight, food in the digestive tract. The other 3.5 kilos will be fat mass, right? So not all of it will be fat mass, but that was still a fairly aggressive kind of dieting phase. Pulling off 5 kilos in 5 weeks is still pretty aggressive. So when do we want to use these and when do we not want to use these? Well, I think for most people, the place you've got to start is how tolerant you are to hunger and what your schedule is looking at. So if you are someone who really, really struggles to stick to things when you have a lot of socials on, often as not, aggressive dieting is not the way because you're just going to feel up against it. If you want to go out for a couple of meals out a week, maybe have a few drinks, not the right approach. I'm sorry, but that's not going to work, right? And I think it's better we're really honest with ourselves because sometimes people say, oh, that's what I want to do. And it's like, right, but you've also got all these socials in the calendar. You like to have a drink at kind of most events. that's probably not going to line up, right? The input isn't going to match the expectation. And that can be the worst thing you do is, I'm going to go really hard for these next 4 weeks and drop a good chunk of weight. You maybe end up dropping like a kilo or something, 1.5 kilos, which is still good progress, but you feel like you failed because you're not dropped as much as you expected, but it's because you didn't look at your schedule, you weren't objective about it, right? So that's one instance. The other thing is about hunger and tolerance to that as well. Is I would say that I don't necessarily get a ton of hunger when I'm dieting. For me, actually, when I kind of have done more aggressive phases of weight loss, actually what often is not is the key thing is energy levels, right? My energy tends to dip earlier in the evening. So if I go a bit more moderate, my calories are a little bit higher, I'm probably going to find that I'm still pretty energetic all through the day and into the evening. Whereas if I go a bit more aggressively, I'm dropping weight faster, it tends to be slightly more limited to just like, I still feel good energy-wise morning and afternoon, but probably not far off the time I am now, about 5 or something o'clock, I'll start to feel a little bit tired, and by 7 or 8, I can start to conk out a little bit. Still able to function, not like exhausted or anything, but just probably not as enthused to do too much after that point in the day. I just feel a little bit more tired. That's my experience. Whereas other people will feel that hunger creeps up a little bit more as well. So this is the other thing. If you are someone who really struggles with feeling hungry at all, one, that's something we kind of have to learn a little bit to live with, right? It's not the end of the world if you're hungry for half an hour before your dinner. I think sometimes we can be so deconditioned to this, and this idea sometimes online where every coach right now says, oh, you'll never be hungry on a diet. Yes, you can have loads of fibre. Yes, you can have loads of veg. But likely as not, if dinner's at 6 and you've been dieting for the last 6 weeks, you're probably going to be looking forward to that dinner quite a lot. That's normal. Now, getting to bed and being starving before bed every night, probably not so good, right? There's maybe something missing there. That's not ideal in terms of hunger. But experiencing a little bit more hunger, yeah, normal, completely normal. So that's something to kind of touch on. So where sometimes aggressive fat loss diets can be helpful is they can be really good for initial motivation. So sometimes with a new client, we will kind of just get stuck right in. We'll try and pull off a few kilos just to get them going and get that momentum up. That can be really, really helpful, especially if someone has a bit of experience with tracking calories and they're quite aware that it is going to be a bit harder and they're willing to make the trade-offs. That's useful. The challenge lies, as I say, is where someone maybe wants that, but they're not willing to make the trade-offs. And that's where I'm going to be really honest with someone as a coach and say, do you know what, let's go a bit more moderate for now. We can always do a more aggressive phase down the line, but hey, let's go steady. Let's just kind of go at this at a level that's useful. And if you've never tracked calories before, you have your nutrition's kind of all over the shop, you have no meal structure at all, you've never kind of like sort of planned ahead with any of your meals, you're going to struggle. This is the sort of trade-off, right? And to talk about some of the drawbacks with aggressive dieting, where we are maybe restricting calories that bit lower, so you're maybe 2, 3, potentially 400 calories lower than you might be at a more kind of moderate deficit, you're not going to have a ton of flexibility. So you kind of making it up on the day, I'll just have a meal deal and I'll grab whatever, that probably won't swing. You're going to start to struggle because your hunger is going to spike because you're not having foods that are filling enough. So it's not always the best option, right? In that scenario, you kind of need to be pretty organized. You need to be a little bit tolerant that you might be a little bit hungrier. And also you've got the right expectation that you're only going to be doing this for a shorter phase, but that might mean saying no more often. So if someone's like, oh, do you fancy just going for a few drinks? You might say, yeah, but I'm going to have soft drinks. Like if you're not willing to do that, yeah, probably not for you, right? That's the reality. That's not to say you can never drink the whole time. However, the more alcohol you consume, the harder it's going to be. And I think that's another thing that kind of sits within this. And this might sound like a lot of negatives, right? But this is a honest kind of representation of what it's like, but also I'm going to talk about some of the kind of perks in a second as well. And I've already touched on one. So this is another piece to it as well. It's like you need to be a little bit willing to drop your alcohol consumption as well, unless you're someone who doesn't drink alcohol very much anyway, and then it probably doesn't matter. Now, in terms of kind of the big pros, it's definitely that you can see quicker progress and that can keep you really, really motivated. That is great and it encourages you along. Where that can have a slight drawback is if you're already fairly lean. So if you're fairly lean and you've only got a few kilos to lose, you can look at it through the lens of I'm only going to have to diet for a short period of time. Great, that's fine. However, The problem sometimes is what you'll experience in terms of hunger is also harsher, right? If someone has 20 kilos to lose or 25 kilos to lose, pulling off 5 or 6 kilos fairly quickly is probably pretty doable. It will be fairly hard, but it's going to be manageable in terms of hunger. Someone who has already dropped 20 kilos, let's say, and is the last 5, doing it might be quite taxing because they're already fairly dieted. They're probably experiencing quite a bit of hunger already at that point because their weight's down so much. All these things can kind of factor in. So that's kind of some of the pros and cons. Like big pros, you just get better buy-in sometimes. You're kind of motivated, you want to crack on. The second kind of one is that, and I think this is probably one of the kind of important ones, and that's a bit interesting, I suppose, is about flexibility. Flexibility is funny because when you're in an aggressive weight loss phase, you do not have as much flexibility. You have to be more structured and more organized. And for some people, they have more success with it because they have to be more organized. There's not this, oh, I can just about get away with it on the calories I'm on. Like I can just about get away with that. They are a little bit more rigid in terms of being like, okay, well, I need to plan my breakfast, lunch, and dinner out. I need to have things in the fridge because if I don't do that, I'm not going to be able to stick to it. So sometimes that the lack of flexibility is actually a good thing because it helps people be a little bit more focused and get into really good routines and get really organized. But of course, as you can imagine, it can work the other way as well. It's like if your life is very variable, you've got lots of social engagements, you travel tons for work, yeah, it's probably going to be a little bit harder to actually adhere to that in the same way. It's going to be quite tough. You do tend to kind of want structure. So that's some of the kind of pros. And as I say, I suppose I've mixed the cons in there as well with kind of what I've said about like, you know, lack of flexibility if you're traveling for work, etc. That can be it as well. Some of the other things to kind of consider that are kind of useful, if you like, pros and cons about more moderate dieting and kind of where we're losing at a more steady pace. The first one is you have a little bit more flexibility. You feel like you can live life a little bit more, whereas someone who is dieting more aggressively, especially if you are smaller and especially if you're a smaller female, you're going to have to make a lot of trade-offs, right? You're not going to be able to do those things. Whereas with your moderate diet, you could probably still go out for meals, like, and as long as you eat sensibly and make good choices, still make progress. We can probably include some alcohol, although I would always argue that the less alcohol you drink, the easier dieting is because you're just eating more of your calories and drinking them. Again, like you can be selective with that, but if you want to have, you know, wine 3-4 times a week, it's going to be hard, really, really hard. If you have to have a glass of wine with every meal out, well, you not only got the extra calories from a meal out, yeah, it's just going to be tough to fit it all in. But you certainly can fit in more on a moderate diet. You can probably fit in the odd snack a little bit more flexibly. You're going to find family meals a little bit easier because you're also more likely to be able to eat with other people and not feel so restrained. So there's a lot of benefits to that more moderate approach. And the other side of it as well is around kind of habit change, etc. is like, because it's more moderate, you tend to be doing it for a little bit longer, you do tend to fall into better routines and it gives you more time to kind of settle into that before we kind of eventually phase out of kind of that faster weight loss phase, let's say, or sorry, out of a weight loss phase and move into maintenance, right? So we get a little bit more of a chance to build some habits, build some routines. So that's another kind of thing in favor of it. Another couple of things that make a bit of a difference, probably less likely to experience as much hunger. So that's something else that's quite useful. So by and large, not always, but most people who go in a more moderate approach are going to experience a little bit more, little less hunger, not more hunger, less hunger. So it feels slightly easier. And obviously within that then makes it feel easier in general, right? Your experience of dieting is gentler. It's just going to feel like, oh, this is like, okay, yeah, I have to put an effort in. I'm trying for sure, but it's not too hard. So that can be really useful in and of itself, is it doesn't feel quite so restrictive. It doesn't feel like it's taking over your life in the same way. You're probably going to find if, for example, you travel a fair bit for work, it's more doable. You can probably fit in a little bit more in terms of meals out, like, and have a bit more flexibility. Like, there's a lot of pros to it, right? The biggest cons, it just takes you a little bit longer to lose that weight, right? Like it does. That's a reality. If you go quite aggressively at something, you pull off weight quicker, you can be done quicker, which is always the bit that's going to sound most appealing. But as we've talked about there's quite a lot of pros to that kind of more moderate approach as well. And I, as I say, don't have a single camp that I prefer. I prefer to use both when they're appropriate. For some people, because of considerations for, let's say, health, that might be something where I've had clients that have been just diagnosed with sort of pre-diabetes, let's say. So they're kind of creeping up at that level. The doctor's saying to them, like, you gain much any more weight or you don't drop weight, you're going to be needing medication really soon. And they're kind of like, right, let's maybe get 5-6 kilos, pull some weight off quite quickly. Then we might go more moderate after that. But that kind of gets them away from an area they don't want to be in. Or where someone has like a more kind of significant deadline, maybe someone's kind of got like a wedding coming up or something like that as well. Although I will always make the argument for you should always leave yourself more time than you think. If you are leaving yourself 3 to 4 weeks before you have an event to see a difference, you're just asking for trouble. It's just not a good strategy. Like, having to aggressively diet when actually a moderate approach is better suited to you is never a sensible thing to do. And let's talk a little bit about that. Who is it best suited to and who's it not best suited to? Well, it's probably better suited, if we talk about the kind of like moderate approach, to people that do have quite busy social lives, that do find it a little bit harder to say no in certain contexts. Again, a bit like dealing with a little bit of hunger. You also need to learn to kind of live with saying no sometimes to people. Like, you can't just say yes to everything or you will get bloody nowhere with weight loss. But it's probably a little bit better. If you also are having lots of family meals, you don't want to cook separately and things like that, or you don't want to have to faff about with your meals and chop and change them too much, probably a little bit more easier to go moderate as well. If you are someone who has got a lot of stress on right now and workload is really, really high, it's also probably not the right time to do it, because it is a little bit more stressful in your body, which sounds like a negative thing when we're kind of in an aggressive phase. It's not really, but it just means that if you're kind of like pretty knackered from work, you're stretched really thin, and you go into an aggressive weight loss phase, you just might find yourself struggling a bit, absolutely shattered by the end of the day and kind of a bit worn out and maybe not feeling quite as energetic, right? Which might be difficult in a job or a period of time that's quite stressful. So in periods of high stress, I'm less of an advocate of it. As I say, in periods of high social life, less of an advocate of it as well. So those are some kind of thoughts about aggressive weight loss and whether it's potentially right for you or not right for you. You'll notice here that I haven't necessarily talked about how many calories you should be on and how you calculate that. The reason for that is it's quite variable. So for me, an aggressive deficit is actually right now quite a high amount of calories. So I'm doing like a little aggressive period of weight loss, and I'm actually sat at 2,000 calories, which you might think, oh my God, but it's because my activity levels are so high. So it is very, very dependent on how active you are and how much weight we are dropping as to what aggressive looks like for you. So for me, I am dropping a good chunk of weight at that kind of like 2,000 mark. So right now, this is probably quite aggressive because I'm losing a lot of weight quite quickly. In the fullness of time, it's likely I would have to pull my calories down quite a bit to carry on at this kind of speed. It's not going to last indefinitely. So that's kind of why I've not touched so much on that in terms of like actually calculating it. There's a little bit more goes into it. It's going to be based on activity levels, etc. Because what might be aggressive for one person, where they might genuinely be on really low calories, 1,100 calories, and someone else who might be on much higher calories, but their activity is proportionately higher. It's more about the gap from where maintenance is down to kind of where that deficit is. That's almost what we need to figure out how aggressive to go. So just to kind of touch on that, but as a rough guide, if you're kind of sitting around that kind of like a 400 to 500 calorie deficit, that probably is in the range of kind of like moderate, right? That's going to average you about half a kilo off a week. That's great. If you're kind of like pushing maybe for more like a kilo a week, you are looking at being at about 1,000 calorie deficit, which means that if your maintenance calories are 2,001, 2,200, you're on 1,200 calories, right? That is the big trade-off. Like, you are eating significantly less food. That's why for some guys it's a little bit easier, because if you're a bit taller, a bit heavier, you're on 2,700 calories as a maintenance. Sitting at 1,700 is pretty tolerable. If you are a small female and your maintenance is 1,700 and you need to be, potentially pulling off 800-900 calories, that's very difficult to do. So this is the other thing that, unfortunately, aggressive diets tend to be a little bit sexist to an extent as well, is that it is a little bit harder for women as well, because your calories sometimes have to go really, really quite low. When people say like, oh, you should never go on X amount of calories, firstly, that's nonsense, because, I've had 4'9" clients, 4'10" clients who have low step counts, sedentary jobs, and not a lot of training experience, so they've not got a lot of muscle mass, their calories are quite low, right? They just are, just a fact of life. So, when you kind of see that stuff, it doesn't give you any real life context. It's just nonsense. You should never diet on this amount of food, is often said by an Instagram influencer who trains quite regularly, maybe 4 or 5 times a week, is relatively young, often has not got a good amount of muscle mass, and often is not actually relatively tall. It's an observation as well. I saw someone posting about this the other day, and I know for a fact, obviously, they're relatively tall, very, very active, training 7, 8, 9 times a week. And they're talking about how you should never be on low calories. And it's like, that's great when you're training 9 times a week. Low calories is relative to your activity levels. Anyway, that has been a fairly detailed one, guys. So any questions about that, please let me know. And as always, if you've got any suggestions for topics, just let me know. I will put the link for one-to-one coaching in the show notes. So if you are struggling a bit with weight loss, you're not sure whether you should go aggressive or more moderate, or you're not really sure where to start, or you're just getting bloody nowhere on your own and you want to make more progress in the next 6 weeks than you did in the last 6 months, then you know where to go. Speak soon.